a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today is on lectures 3 and 4 in seminar 2. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. How does the unconscious emerge from the symbolic? 2. What is the ego's function in relation to the unconscious and consciousness? 3. How does the subject identify with ego? If you learned something from this video and wish to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. Lectures 3 and 4 are conceptually dense. They also overlap with material covered in Seminar 1, but with some notable distinctions and nuances. I'll focus our analysis on what's new, or how what is being presented.
但是话又说回来，为什么要继续学？我今天在这个群里面，我终于认真的决定看一看德勒兹，因为之前我看的都是都是二手的。然后那个拉黑字幕组群里面有一个老哥很厉害，他竟然搞到了一个就是反俄狄浦斯的一个中译，你们也知道那个中译还没出，就就是卷2，就是资本主义跟什么精神分裂，就卷2千高原中译出了，但是卷1还没出。但是我为了保护，就是我也不知道怎么搞来的，反正是安利是有中译本，那其实没有中译本我也可以看英文的啦。但我这个人真的，你要让我就是说看德勒兹看英文的，那我真的就懒得看。我为什么要看他看英文？那我这时间看点别的不行吗？我有的时间看研讨班不好吗？然后就是中文，我想说中文，那我就对付着看一看好了。然后就那个中译本我看了之后，我真的觉得说，就不得不说真的是对以拖待变，就是怎么说呢？就是说，哎呦，真的是满口胡言这种感觉。因为你们现在说实话，你们看了这个，就是说，如果你们是沿着什么黑格尔什么对拉康、齐泽克、海德格尔，你这样看下来，你再看德勒兹，就是以拖待变，就这种感觉。然后你看了之后，你能理解他为什么就是会就是写福柯，因为大概福柯是唯一能理解的。就是德里达比德勒兹还是强很多的，就是他那个什么那个书我看了，就我们就说他那个书名好了，叫什么无器官的身体这种东西。然后无器官的身体，然后那个跟这个，然后器官是什么？器官就是欲望机器，就类似这种东西。但是事实上，如果你稍微理解辩证法，你就会知道，就是齐德克反驳他写那篇文章嘛，就是无身体的器官嘛，对吧？就是器官跟身体是一个辩证关系嘛。你没有器官的身体，那个身体就是它也不是身体，就简单来说，它是依赖于这个在场不在场这种关系的。其实可能无身体器官就是讲的就是拉康的 partial object 或者是那些东西，就有赖于想象他们统一的整体什么之类的。我想看该怎么说呢？就是说没有什么哲学性，我只能这么说，也没有什么现象学，所以说比德里达差很多感觉。所以这评价真的就是以拖待变，所以我们还是来认真学拉康吧。
It adds to what came before. So our first question is, how does the unconscious emerge from the symbolic? The concept of the symbolic is introduced here following a lecture delivered by Levi-Strauss, who wrote the book.
但是根据魏明子的说法嘛，对，他说德勒兹这个东西就是那种高级知识分子的享乐背书啦，就这个意思。
Book, The Elementary Structures of Kinship, published in 1949. Elementary structures consist of networks of commands, indications, and prohibitions. They specify who a person should marry and how such marriages should enact exchanges among different social groups. These rules form a system that intervenes and orders the human world. It's an emergent function not found in nature, but operates in every aspect of life so as to seem as if it were natural. As such, it imposes itself as a totality, a symbolic universe that structures our entire existence. Lacan also calls the symbolic the world of the machine. It's an impersonal, unindividuated function that one is inside of. And Lacan emphasizes that one's inside of the symbolic rather than the symbolic being inside of us. The idea of the machine also communicates the automaticity by which it operates. The symbolic does not have to be put into action. It always already is functioning. It operates differently than the animal, which Lacan calls a jammed machine, which operates with a narrow set of operations strictly determined by demands of the external environment. The machine associated with the human symbolic is thought of as something closer to a kind of information processing model dealing with inputs, computational processes, and outputs. The important point here is that it's a much more dynamic machine than that of the animal. There are elements of one's history pertaining to desire that are not structured by the symbolic in an integrated fashion. This gives rise to the unconscious subject. It's created when the symbolic meets with those elements of one's history resistant to symbolization, forming what Lacan calls here the core of our being, and what he called in Seminar 1 the pathogenic nucleus, or its integrated desire animal. There are elements of one's history pertaining to desire that are not structured by the symbolic in an integrated fashion. This gives rise to the unconscious subject. It's created when the symbolic meets with those elements of one's history resistant to symbolization, forming what Lacan calls here the core of our being, and what he called in Seminar 1 the pathogenic nucleus. The core of our being functions like a gap or hole around which we form our experiences. Elsewhere, it will be conceptualized as the missing signifier around which life becomes organized. The unconscious is the element unknown to the ego, or more accurately, it is misrecognized by the ego. Here it finally becomes clear that the nucleus is not the ego, rather the ego is what misrecognizes this core of our being. So this leads us to our second question. What is the ego's function in relation to the unconscious and consciousness? We can now better appreciate the function of the ego as the source of resistance to recognizing the unconscious. Lacan defines the ego here as the sum of the prejudices which any knowledge comprises.
看这里是在早期的，他到晚期4种话语就比较好，这里讲的还是不太行。我说拉康的本人讲的也不太行。到晚期4种话语是真正颠覆性的。
In which each of us has as individual baggage. It is something which includes what we know or think we know, for knowing is always in some way believing someone knows. Let's consider how prejudices work. As the word suggests, they are judgments made in advance of some incoming information. When applied to people, these prejudgments tend to shape our experience of others, what we pay attention to and what we remember. Prejudices can also lead us to distorted interpretations of what we do observe and are generally resistant to information that contradicts our pre-existing beliefs. We might think of the ego as a kind of mechanism that facilitates confirmation bias. In the present context, the ego's prejudices are toward the unconscious, leading to both resistance and misrecognition. Notice that we don't say that the unconscious goes unrecognized, but rather misrecognized, meaning a distortion and not just simple ignorance. Resistance to a genuine recognition of the unconscious happens because such recognition would entail a decentering of that ego, moving it off its habitual center. Now, the odd thing here is that what is being misrecognized is none other than what founds the ego in the first place, the subject. The ego is that part of the subject that the subject is fixated upon. It is the fundamental central structure of our experience. Related to this is that the ego gets perceived as the unity of consciousness itself. Despite this, however, the ego is not equivalent to consciousness. And here Lacan gives us a better understanding of what consciousness is. And to understand his analysis here, it would be helpful to look back at the optical schema. Though it's not explicitly mentioned here, much of what Lacan says regarding consciousness and the ego continues to map onto the schema. If we recall, we have this curved mirror here, which was identified by Lacan in Seminar 1 as the cortex. Here he elaborates upon this idea by suggesting that the area striata of the occipital lobe is exactly like a mirror. Consciousness is then the reflected image of this mirror. Hence, Lacan provides us with what he considers to be a materialist definition of consciousness, which is the title of Lecture 4. What is perceived within the field of consciousness is the object of the ego. Now, this ego resides in an imaginary space, projecting as an alienated virtual unity. This is what we saw in the case of the bouquet and flowers, which form that unity when perceived at the right angle, as the real images bounce off the concave mirror off the cortex. Elsewhere, he states that the ego's relation with consciousness is one of tension, which later in the seminar he will state is a tension between the tension, which elsewhere he states that the ego's relation with consciousness is one of tension, which later in the seminar he will state is a tension between the ego as alienated from the subject and the purely perceptual dimension of consciousness that escapes the ego. To better understand the relation between the subject and the ego, Lacan offers an apologue of the blind man and the paralytic. The paralytic is the subject prior to its identification with the ego. For us humans, there's already a crack, a profound perturbation of the regulation of life. That fragmentation concerns not only the lack of mastery over our bodily movements, but also our desire, which is not so neatly structured out of the gate as it is for the animal. In this situation, the paralytic looks out to the world and becomes fascinated by the blind man, who is ambulating throughout his environment just fine. This other displays the kind of unity of bodily experience that the paralytic wishes for itself. And out of that desire acquires a profound fascination with the other's image. The blind man is the ego, who is the master of the paralytic, carrying him around. The use of the word fascination is very appropriate here. Etymologically, to fascinate comes from the word fascinare, meaning to bewitch or enchant. And its earliest uses were applied to witches and serpents that could cast a spell by a look that rendered one unable to move or resist. Also, it's related to the Latin word fascinum, meaning human penis or artificial phallus. Lacan has to address the concept of the phallus in these seminars, but let's keep that in mind as a question concerning the relation between that symbol and the ego, an ego which is not only a function but also is a symbol itself. The critical point in considering the relation of the ego and the subject is that they are not equivalent. Rather, the ego is an object within the experience of the subject. Whenever I say I am ... we're identifying with the ego. The ... is always the me. So we always are saying I am me, even if I'm saying I am a professor, I am a father, I am a son. This is easier to grasp in the French.
自我是主体的主人，又开始胡说八道。啥时候说是主体的主人了？不是一直在说自我是个误认吗？自我是个客体，我的天哪！不是人家原话就这么说的，你为什么会理解的不对？而且理解不对，为什么还好意思说出来啊？我真服气。
French, since what we call the ego is often named le moi in French, the me. This is the pronoun we use to refer to ourselves as an object. That is me. What is important here is not the grammatical dimension of it, however, but the function it plays in the life of the subject. Lacan's point is that the I that says I am me, or again, I am a son or I am a father, that I that says I am me is not the same as the me, even though it is what the I identifies with at that moment. With that, we'll end today. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.
主要是拉康这里的观点还是观念还是有一些问题，它还是有一种结构主义的主体观，讲的都4种话语就好了，就是这个主体不过是能指滑动产生的效果，那么能指它是以4种方式滑动的，就是4种话语的方式，所以就是说那个主体的位置就现在变成了 truth 跟 agent 嘛，就 truth 跟 agent 的那个失败之处，就是言说的失败就是主体嘛，然后 研究失败的主体，但是它这里是区分的，比如说什么主体跟什么自我之类的。但是这个主体跟自我呢，应该这样说，自我这个概念不是一个需要解释概念，因为自我这个概念本身就是一个误认 misunderstanding， 所以事实上它这里只是解释说自我是如何成为，就是 ego 是如何被当成是某个，就刚才说什么什么主人或者什么统一的印象，就是这个概念是从哪里来，或者这个感觉这个误认就是自我。但是事实上也没有什么自我这种东西了，因为这个东西你稍微拧一拧就能拧过来吗？我们上次不是也在讲这个事情吗？就是说有人会用什么第三人称就是称呼自己嘛，就是说这个自我这个东西不过是你的这个主体中的一个客体，就是它已经是被对象化了的，对吧？它大概就是这个意思。但是事实上就是人们不加反思的把这种直观的感性的认识，就是把它自然而然的，就是我思故我在嘛，我怀有故我在嘛，就把它直接是当成是自我，当成是主体接受了下来。但是把这个自我当成是主体接受了下来，所以说他就是说，我就跟你们说，其实不用解释自我是一个，就是他也没有想解释什么是自我，他只是想解释说，就是自我其实只是一个误认啦，就是 ego。其实说就是说，我们不应该用 ego 或自我这个东西来讨论，以这个范式来讨论，就是说关于主体的，因为主体毕竟分裂主体嘛，对吧？刚刚原出的是这个无意识，那么无意识就是主体这个效果是什么？其实就是4种话语的模式了，就是这个 agent 跟 truth 的失败，就是那个象征切割时代的剩余了。
Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today is on lectures 5 and 6 in seminar 2. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. How is the death drive evident in Freud's early essay, The Project for a Scientific Psychology? 2. What does it mean to say the subject is no one? And 3. How does reflexivity produce the unconscious and its insistence? If you learned something from this video and wish to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. In these 2 lectures, we are introduced to the dynamics of psychic reality, how compromises are sought between the pleasure principle and reality principle, as well as how, no matter the compromise struck between these 2 principles, there remains something that upsets the balance, giving rise to a beyond of the pleasure principle. So let us begin with question 1. How is the death drive evident in Freud's early essay, The Project for a Scientific Psychology? This essay by Freud, written in 1895, though unpublished in Freud's lifetime, provides a glimpse into Freud's early thought and how its ideas find their way back into his later writings, especially in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. The essay develops an economic model of the nervous system aimed at providing a physiological basis for psychopathology. Freud proposes a principle of inertia or homeostasis, which is the mind's default mode whereby it seeks to restore itself to a lower state of tension. The pleasure principle, symbolized by psi, addresses tensions arising endogenously from one's internal environment, symbolized by Q eta. The reality principle, which is symbolized by phi, addresses tensions arising exogenously from one's outside environment, symbolized by Q, or external quantity. Psychic reality emerges from the intersection of these 2 principles. Though both principles aim at decreasing tension, they go about it in different ways. The reality principle does not try to completely rid the psychic system of tension, since it needs some to mobilize the will to act and to deal with the demands of the external world, what Freud calls the exigencies of life. When it wishes to reduce tension, it can do so by withdrawing or fleeing from its source. But such a strategy is not available to the pleasure principle, which addresses tensions arising endogenously, such as the bodily demands for hunger and sex. Like the reality principle, the preferred path of discharge would be what Freud calls a flight from the stimulus. However, withdrawing from the body is not an option as it is to withdraw from the external environment. Instead, endogenous tension is reduced by taking specific actions in the external world. Here we can appreciate what might be the beginning connection between repetition and the death drive. If the death drive is a tendency to reduce tension to the point of seeking the cessation of life, and external action is the primary means of reducing such tension, then the compulsion to repeat is an expression of this attempt at a radical reduction of tension to return to our original inert state of inorganic material. We may wonder how the death drive and the pleasure principle are distinct, since they seem to both aim at reducing tension. For Lacan, the life drive, which expresses the pleasure principle, and the death drive are not the opposing forces that they're often understood to be with Freud. The life drive is in the service of the death drive. However, it diverts it in such a way as to sustain life rather than to end it. Question 2. What does it mean to say the subject is no one? The subject is no one according to Lacan. It's not an individual, and especially not a personality. In the French, Lacan states le sujet est personne. There's a peculiarity in the French language in which the word personne can mean either no one or a person. What's not certain is whether Lacan is engaging in some wordplay here. There's several reasons why I suspect he is. First, Lacan tends to play with the sounds and double meaning of words, as is evident in his concept of le nom du père. This translates to the name of the father, but since the M is silent, it also sounds like the no of the father. And in fact, both interpretations are correct in the sense that the name of the father has a prohibitive function. Second, I suspect a play on words because at other places in his seminars, Lacan identifies the subject and its history as a singularity, which is also the locus of truth. To say the subject is no one would ordinarily suggest that the subject is some formless, unindividuated principle. Yet this no one, this person, is more likely a rejection of the kind of individuality that's being promoted by the ego, rather than the uniqueness of the subject, who is distinguished not by a set of personality traits, but by the way the other lives through it. Here, we seem to find a notion of the subject that's somewhat reminiscent of a particular theological understanding of persons found in the writings of the early church fathers, expressed by the concept of hypostasis. This Greek word came to be translated in Latin as persona. So what is a hypostasis, and how is it in any way like Lacan's notion of the subject? Just as the subject is distinguished from the ego, so too the hypostasis is distinguished from the prosopon, or the mask one wears, what we might call one's personality. A hypostasis is an individual's being, but it's different from the impersonal being of the ancient Greeks. It's a highly particular being, a singularity, if you will. Again, we're reminded of Lacan's identifying of the symbolic with being, a being that is also singular. Finally, the hypostasis is itself sustained only through the other, which of course in a religious context is principally understood to be the divine other. The point here is not whether the subject and the hypostasis converge entirely. In fact, Metropolitan John Zizulas, in his work Communion and Otherness, suggests that they do not, as Lacan holds an entirely distinct understanding of otherness in his view. Nonetheless, this analysis does suggest that perhaps behind Lacan's statement that le sujet est personne is the appropriation of a concept originating from theology, a move he makes from time to time in these seminars. Question 3. How does reflexivity...
这个人就是像那个豆瓣文青币一样，对电影开始进行过度解读。其实他刚刚那个双关，他喜欢说双关，为什么？就是很简单，因为双关是一个过程嘛。双关就是，哎呀，我给你画一个图，这是语言的暗喻了 ，metaphor。因为双关就是这样嘛，对吧？或者我们用那个4种话语来画。 双关其实就是这个过程，就是一个转喻的过程，一个暗喻的过程 metaphor 的过程。但是 metaphor 的过程其实就是一个失败的过程嘛。为什么它是一个失败？它作为何种意义上是失败的？就当我们说失败，我们是什么意思？就是它生产不出来一个 concept 嘛，它生产不出来一个概念嘛，生产不出来一个 conception 嘛，在这个意义上它是失败的。因为你生产不出的 conception 就意味着主观跟客观没办法一致嘛，主观跟客观不一致的时候，就是没有办法生产知识嘛，对吧？但是事实上，就是这个失败正是通过这个失败才生产出了知识，因为所有的这个能指它必须是通过这个 ambiguities 这个 meaning 才是自由的。所以说双关就是这样的一个过程，就是说它无法将这个它能指链始终在滑动，始终无法固定下来，但是它就是因为这个滑动无法固定下来，所以它才产生了 meaning。或者我们这么说好了，就是我们日常的认为的一些 meaning 其实全部都是有问题的，就是我们其实日常所说的那些东西全部都是失败，全部都是已经失败了的。但是因为我们不反思这个问题，就是以一种主人话语嘛，主人话语把它认为是，就是以一种主人话语强行的就是对里面的这个 ambiguity， 就是对它里面的自由视而不见。你能想明白这个问题，你就知道罗素他们在干嘛了。就是为什么他要搞数理逻辑，因为他忽然发现在这个我们这个反思性到达一定程度的时候，到了这个科学，比如说什么这个大学话语，就主人能指逐渐失效了嘛，对吧？因为主人能指之前就是说知识就是知识，真理就是真理，对不对？说了一大堆什么公理定理，但事实上那些公理定理全部都没有被证明过。就是那一套形式逻辑系统其实也是有问题的，因为它只在一定的这个，那我们这么说好了，比如说那个我们所谓的什么什么哥白尼的什么革命，对不对？拉康就会说，其实不是拉康会说，这个名字也会讲，所有人都会讲，就比如说哥白尼的革命其实也不是什么革命，因为他的革命也是错的，就是哥白尼推翻了什么什么地心说，认为是日心说，但事实上也不是日心说啊。事实上它是地心还是日心，就完全是你视角的问题嘛。你也可以把它认为是，你把地球当做宇宙的中心也未尝不可以啊，对吧？你们品一品这个事情，就是说我们认为说，比如这是某种哥白尼的革命，它是什么？那其实只是你用这个主人能指，你强行去让别人认同一个这个就已然失败的一种东西。就是语言其实就是一种失败，因为它事实上它内部就是 ambiguities， 就是这样子的，你没有办法用这个语言来讨论说这些概念。所以后来罗素就用这个数理逻辑嘛，对吧？他试图用这个数理逻辑，但是后来罗素也发现这个他也失败了因为数理逻辑还是解决不了这个理发师悖论的问题嘛，对吧？就这个其实也是集合论的问题嘛，集合论也解决不了这个问题了，所以他就放弃了，也不叫放弃了，就是他终于愿意承认这种失败。过去是不承认这种失败，对不对？过去那个发现无理数那个毕达哥拉斯的徒弟还被他扔下去了就理发师悖论他们就发现这种失败了，对不对？就是这个 A 等于什么？因为这个 A 始终它就是要掉出去的，当你试图言说这个 A 把它扩起来的时候，又有一个 A 掉出去了，就是始终有个东西要掉出去。它这个数理逻辑就是纯粹它就处理不了这个不在场的问题了。但是语言是可以，能指是可以的，因为能指它的意义就是由于这个不在场的东西这种失败产生了嘛。但是就是说罗素试图想来阐释这个 S1 用这个集合论，但是他每次他都失败了，因为他就没有办法，就当你在这个进行言说时候，它主体就是掉出去了嘛。后来就受不了这个事情了。所以说罗素的失败就证明了什么？就证明了这个主人话语的失效嘛。所以说这里他讲了，你们可以懂了吧？就是说我就给你们讲为什么拉康喜欢这个讲双关，因为双关就是那个他把那个失败的过程展示了出来，就是把他自己那个模糊的过程，就是概念化失败的过程展示了出来。所以说这个形式其实更加重要的，远比的内容重要。所以就是我为什么给你们补充这些，就是说这些人在分析这些问题的时候，他们始终还是保持在对内容的分析上，就他们从来不分析这个形式，就重点是这个形式，这个双关语的形式，因为这个形式就是一个失败的形式，并不是在它的内容象征着什么，那个是次要的问题。
produce the unconscious and its insistence. In addition to saying the subject is no one, in these lectures, Lacan also claims that the unconscious subject occurs when the subject takes itself into account. To understand how this might be possible, let's turn to set theory and Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which, as has been argued, have had some influence on Lacan. Set theory is a kind of mathematical logic that considers sets or collections of things or objects or numbers. Gödel's incompleteness theorems demonstrate the impossibility of complete certainty and consistency concerning mathematical truths within a number set. I strongly recommend a recent video uploaded by Veritasium entitled "This is Math's Fatal Flaw," which goes into depth about set theory and Gödel's theorem. You should probably watch it keeping in mind Lacan's understanding of the unconscious. I think you'll find some notable implications. I provided a link to it in the description. What's interesting for us here is that mathematical sets seem to get along just fine. That is, they remain provable and consistent up until they take themselves into account. To illustrate this, I'll look at a logical paradox rather than a mathematical one. I understand that they're not the same thing, which is an error sometimes attributed to Wittgenstein in his own analysis of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Nonetheless, it's hopefully illustrative for our purposes here. So let's take the set of all truth statements. A truth statement, when properly worded, should be either true or false. A dog barks is true. A cat lays eggs is false. But then, if you run across a sentence like this sentence is false. Like Lacan's depiction of the unconscious, it's a statement that takes itself into account. But in doing so, it produces a paradox. If the sentence is true, then the sentence is false. If this sentence is false, then it's true. It's a claim that is intrinsically undecidable. Such paradoxes can be found in certain mathematical statements as well, which render impossible the establishment of certainty and consistency of a number set, since a numerical set, for it to be complete, must account for itself as well. Consequently, such statements must be excluded from the set, and yet doing so results in that number set being incomplete. We can now see the relevance of Lacan's claim that the unconscious originates from the subject taking itself into account. Just as the reflexive statement creates an endlessly repeating loop without resolution, the reflexive turn of the subject produces an insistence or compulsion to repeat that prevents satisfaction. Now, how or where is this insistence created? Lacan suggests that there are different registers that can be used. In Seminar 3, he'll indicate that it's the insistence of speech, whereby a specific signifier seeks a return to the life of the subject, despite the resistances of the ego to block it. When we're talking about a reflexive turn of the subject, we are speaking of signifiers addressing themselves in a sort of fixed pattern. However, the entire symbolic does not operate like this. Ordinarily, each signifier connects to other signifiers in a signifying chain, but the signifier that refers to itself is disconnected from the rest of the chain and operates independently. And though I'm going a bit far afield from what's stated in lectures 5 and 6, it would seem that trauma is the origin of this reflexivity. Trauma is assigned a signifier, which is what makes the trauma traumatic retroactively. But that signifier is repressed, and instead of associating with other signifiers, it associates only with itself in such a manner that might be what produces the unconscious itself. This insistence of the signifier manifests itself in the compulsion to repeat, which is expressed through external actions, and especially transference. In Freud's essay discussed earlier in this video, he noted that such actions represent an attempt to reduce tension, though in a way that is ultimately destructive toward oneself and others. And so we're offered some insight into the relationship between competition and the death drive. We'll continue to unfold and clarify these ideas as we progress. And with that, we'll end today's video. In the next video, we'll examine Lecture 7, where we consider Lacan's assessment of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology as it's applied to psychoanalysis. Thanks for watching. Until next time, be well.
Long live combat.
还想听吗？你们还想学吗？不学我们就干别的。我看你们都睡着了，已经没人说话了。这一期有点难吗？不能理解吗？我觉得并不难呀。他这一期就是讲，这一期你们都会念经，都会复读的。这到底 ego 是什么，自我是什么，并不难呀。他只要后面讲那个什么什么无意识是如何从自我是从这个能指中产生的。但这个微命子也讲过了，并不难呀。你们记不记得就phallus呢？第一个phallus能指是如何出现的？讲的有点无聊。学习过程总是这样枯燥的，其实并不无聊。我觉得你们无聊是你们没有把这个东西跟你们就是说日常那些经验中结合起来。我跟你说，学哲学最有趣的地方就在于，就是哲学其实就是在颠覆你所有的常识。就是你觉得无聊，就是你还是没有意识到他在讲什么。比如说他讲的时候，你看的时候你会觉得好奇，你就不会无聊，说自我到底是什么，对不对？你就开始反思所有自己关于自我的那些经验什么什么之类的。对啊，什么理发师悖论这种常识，就是你想想这些东西就会觉得蛮有趣的，怎么会无聊？不是，我是教你们一个思考的方法，就是你觉得无聊的时候，你就思考一下这个问题，然后你再试图理解他的思路，就不会无聊。而且你还可以试图跟他抬杠呀，因为他说的很多东西也不是对的。像刚才他后来说什么什么理发师悖论啊，什么什么这种问题，就是拉康所说的就无意识到底是什么，他这里其实没有讲明白。其实这里这老易之前不是讲那什么排中律嘛，就统一律、排中律，什么 A 等于 A 什么这种东西，其实讲过了。只不过是这些东西都是这个，就是说这个答案的一部分，但是它总归最后解决的思路全是辩证法式的。什么是全是辩证法式的？就是存在与非存在，在场与非在场，在场与缺席的这种辩证关系啦。比如说刚才我们讲的那个就是我给你们画这个4种话语，到底是为什么画这个4种话语？为什么我说这个比较关键？因为你不理解4种话语的话，你不理解这个辩证关系的话，他这里讲的东西都不对，也不是都不对吧？就是说他很费劲。是怎么着来着？这样是不是？这样，就是因为我们如果按照他讲的，对吧？就按照他这种思路，他这个语言是没有办法的，就是一种这个时间线性、时间性的程式化的 A 等于 A 主词谓词的这种语言。这个语言太费劲了，讲这个东西，所以我就是让你用这个东西好讲，就是你看这个就比较容易理解，就比看这个东西能理解嘛。它语言它就是用这种线性时间观，什么 A 等于 A， 然后它为了保持这个东西，就是这个所有东西其实都是失败嘛。就是比如说他会说无意识是什么，然后什么什么主体是什么，然后什么自我是什么，自我是一种误认，然后无意识又是什么，什么主体又是什么。它太费劲了，就是你就理解这个图，你就知道主体是什么，主体就是这样子的。然后就是说它这个过程就是这样的一个失败的过程，就这个是那个，这是自我的误认，然后这个是就是说它是这样的一个失败的过程。这个暗喻是什么？这个暗喻是蛮重要的。这个暗喻事实上就是存在与非存在、缺席跟在场的辩证法嘛，就是门嘛，就是洞嘛，这个东西。比如说母亲，我们再来讲那个最基本的，母亲是什么？母亲其实就是父亲的暗喻啦，母亲就是父亲不在场。母亲就是这个不加咖啡的、不加奶的咖啡，它是个咖啡，是个黑咖啡什么的。但是事实上他是父亲的不在场，这个可以理解吧？不，这个可以理解吧？这就是最基本的暗喻啊 ，metaphor， 一个最基本的暗喻 metaphor。我们再举一些其他的，其实这个是普遍存在的，只不过是它这种暗喻的方式是以不同的话语的方式组织起来的。比如说我们再随便举一个，这个那谁齐德克不是也经常讲嘛，就是那个中相，那个什么什么女仆官员扫烟囱的官员，齐德克不是老举这个例子吗？ 就是事实上这个暗语是通过了一个中相去中介它的。我看看有没有讲这个女仆扫烟囱，懒得讲。行吧，往下听吧，这个以后有功夫再慢慢讲吧，忒费劲了。
Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today is on Lecture 7 in Seminar 2. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. What is the connection between Merleau-Ponty's thought and psychoanalysis? 2. How well do Lacan's critiques of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology hold up when considering his later philosophy? And 3. What is the relationship between the death drive and the pleasure principle? If you learned something from this video and wish to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. Lecture 7 is very rich in ideas. So much so, in fact, that I'll be dedicating 2 videos to it. We begin this lecture, as we often have in this seminar, with Lacan mentioning another talk recently delivered, this time by the phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Lacan raises several concerns regarding Merleau-Ponty's position vis-a-vis psychoanalysis. Before discussing those concerns, it may be helpful to address our first question. 1. What is the connection between Merleau-Ponty's thought and psychoanalysis? In answering this question, it's perhaps best to separate out what is considered Merleau-Ponty's early thought from his later thought, since though there are notable continuities, his earlier work, such as the Phenomenology of Perception, published in 1945, places more emphasis on consciousness, lived experience, and Gestaltism. Lacan's critiques seem to be geared more toward this period of work. This is understandable since, at the time of Merleau-Ponty's lecture in 1955, he was perhaps just starting to develop what will come to consist of his later thought. In the Phenomenology of Perception, he argues that perception is the background and presupposition of all action. This connection between perception and action marks a break from at least 2 kinds of dualisms. One of those dualisms is between subject and object. The conception of knowledge as representation proposes that there is a correlation between the idea I have in my mind and the reality out there, which presupposes a divide between the subject and the object. The second dualism is between mind and body. Descartes established that we are made of 2 distinct substances, a non-physical substance, the mind, and a physical substance, the extended body. Like the subject-object dichotomy, a difficulty then needs to be resolved concerning how these 2 relate to one another. Though Descartes is perhaps the most prominent name associated with this view, it seems clear that Merleau-Ponty also has in mind a more recent figure, Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre also established 2 dimensions, our being in itself and our being for itself. We'll leave aside for now the 3rd dimension, which is being for the other. Being in itself is our facticity and immanence, those things that we have no control over. This includes the constitution of our bodies, its capacities, and genetic endowments. The other is our being for itself, which is our possibility and transcendence, that for which we have freedom to choose our possibilities. Sartre identifies this as consciousness and subjectivity. He places a great priority on our being for itself. I don't think it's as simple as this, but since this is not a lecture on Sartre, we'll leave it be for the moment. Merleau-Ponty, in contrast, sees our bodies as the site of our facticity and our freedom. So he argues against the kind of dualism he perceives in Sartre's thought, in favor of a unified view of human subjectivity as a lived body, which is a unification of the being in itself and the being for itself. He writes that the body is the first locus of intentionality, as pure presence to the world and openness upon its possibilities. The word intentionality here refers to our ability to act in the world, to move, will, desire. In sum, to actualize possibilities. Motility, or movement, is the basic mode of intentionality which opens the world to us in its fundamental I can, rather than the I think. Movement entails moving in space, and Merleau-Ponty develops a notion of space that's not an objective measure of distances between objects. Rather, Spatiality, as opposed to space, is a realm of possibility where I can move from here to there, from my present to my future, from actuality to possibility. How I move in my spatiality defines me. At the same time, I can become enclosed in a narrow spatiality. My possibilities can be limited by outside forces, prejudices, laws, etc., which restrict me. So we can see here how the relationship between the internal and external is also unified, moving us past the dichotomy of subject and object. Lacan, in Lecture 7, primarily focuses on the problematic notion of Gestaltism in Merleau-Ponty's thought. Gestalt theory considers the structures of perception in which the whole of experience exceeds what can be reduced to elements or parts of that experience. For example, when I perceive a figure, I don't just perceive it in a void, but always with a background. In certain optical illusions, one can demonstrate how the figure and ground can at times be fluidly switched to create alternating gestalts. Merleau-Ponty found this position attractive for its philosophical implications. It showed how the experience of the world is always already imbued with interpretive meaning, to such a degree that one can't neatly separate the perceptual from the conceptual. In other words, our perceptual experience of the world is always already a unity of subject and object, rather than a correlation between my subjectivity here and the objective reality over.
这里懂了他在说什么吗？这个现象学梅洛庞蒂跟德里达是一致的。其实这个就是我们说的这个声音跟在场的剩余嘛，只不过这里是就是知觉的剩余嘛。可以理解这里的意思吗？你们都在放空是吧？全部都在放空，不懂你就想想看我今天给你们讲那个德里达的现象学关于声音的嘛，关于言语的嘛，这是一样的。比如说你看这个猫猫好了。比如说，你来看这个猫猫，你看它的脸，给大家看看，看看它的脸，是不是好可爱？臭烘烘的，你快去拉屎！臭烘烘。这个世界是充满了 interpretation 的，你们有没有想过这个问题？哎，有时候魏明子会讲那个现象学啊，他那个脸中脸那一期，你们记得吗？脸中脸那一期就是梅洛庞蒂这个意思，就是那个小脸是不在场的。魏明子的脸中脸那一期是个标准的现象学解读，就是他的现象学真的很厉害，我在那方面比他差很多，就是反思力真的不够。就是这个我这张漂亮的脸蛋，这个美丽是通过什么建构的？是通过这个脸中脸的这个恐怖那个骷髅建构出来的，对不对？但是当你看我的这个脸的时候，你看不到里面那张小，你看这张脸上就觉得美丽，你已经带了某种 interpretation 了。你这个不是单纯的看，就是说，比如说刚才你们看那个猫猫，你们刚才看那个猫猫就觉得可爱的那张脸，对不对？但是你不会去，就是说，当你把这个 interpretation 去掉的时候，某种时候你就看那种就是说，就是比较就是莫名其妙的东西，能明白这个问题吗？其实就是声音啦，你们想想看。你们听我说这些话的时候，你们根本就没有注意我的那个语调嘛，那个不在场的。我现在就是说话的时候，我把我的那个所有的那个叫什么，所有那个意义拿掉，我把 meaning 拿掉 ，interpretation 拿掉，你就能听到这个声音了，对不对？但是我只要里面有这个语言，有语言在，你就听不见这个声音了。这就是现象学是如何从这个意向性切换到这个 interpretation 的。意向性就是某种就是潜意识化的那个也或者叫这个我不敢说啊，因为我现象学本来就很差。就是说大概这里的意思不是你过滤了很多东西，它没有这样的过程，你这个过滤的过程还是那个主体跟客体的二元的过程嘛。你的主体跟客体二元，就是你有一个主体，然后你去认识客体， 然后你在认识的过程中，你可能会过滤或者会怎么样。如果你还是这样想的话，你就还是没有突破这个，就你还是没有理解精神分析这些主体观之类的。我们对世界的知觉经验总是主体和客体的统一，不是我们这边的主体跟那边的客观现实之间的关联。为什么总是主体跟客体的统一？这也就是之前讲的回溯性嘛。
This emphasis on the unity of experience, of mind and body, self and environment, for Lacan situates Merleau-Ponty's thought in the imaginary. So with that,
美是如何发生的？美是如何发生的？你就是刚才那个脸中脸，它就是给你讲了美的发生学的机制嘛。美往前再一步是什么？美往前再一步就是美跟恐怖是同样的一个机制，这个机制其实就是对实在的防御，死如秋叶之静美，对吧？死亡也是具有某种美感的嘛，因为你处理不了死亡嘛，对吧？你处理不了那种过量快感嘛，就把它走到最后，以一种美学姿态筑起了一道这个边界。是恐怖这个，就是这么说好了，那个精神病人、精神分裂症或者我们说的什么疯的什么的，他们是不知道什么是美的，也不是说他们不知道什么是美的吧，或者说在他们那儿就没有这种什么美跟什么丑的那种主观感受了，就他们就因为他们已经被那个实在过来的快感所淹没了嘛，他们那边只剩下那种就是自动机了，就自动机的那些机制跟那个什么
Merleau-Ponty's views on psychoanalysis fit in here. Consistent with what I've already presented to you from the phenomenology of perception, he states that the significance of psychoanalysis is in discovering a dialectic that disrupts the binary between the bodily and the mental. He goes so far as to say that not only does psychoanalysis not oppose phenomenology, it helps develop it by showing how human action is always already meaningful. So let's move to question 2. How well do Lacan's critiques of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology hold up when considering his later philosophy? The talk by Merleau-Ponty mentioned by Lacan in Lecture 7 was delivered on January 18, 1955, under the title Philosophy and Psychoanalysis. I've been unable to identify whether this talk was ever published. However, a short essay entitled Phenomenology and Psychoanalysis was published in 1960 and served as a preface for Esnar's The Work of Freud and Its Importance for the Modern World. It's uncertain how much of the 1955 talk remains in this 1960 essay. I suspect there were some major changes, as the 1960 essay clearly reflects some of Merleau-Ponty's later thought, which in fact Lacan speaks of much more approvingly in Seminar 11. This later thought shifts from his earlier emphasis on Gestaltism and consciousness. In The Visible and the Invisible, he begins to develop a distinct ontology of the invisible, which he calls wild being, as well as the concept of the flesh.
所以现象学就是在早期的梅洛庞蒂早期那个现象学，他还是没有能力处理这个不在场的问题嘛，就是他隐隐约约的讨论到这个，比如说我们刚才说的格式塔，对不对？但是格式塔它还是没有处理那个不在场的问题，它还是说你的知觉范围内的一些在场的东西嘛，对吧？但是对格式塔也处理这个问题了，就比如说这个整体大一部分之和是不能拆分的，比如说格式塔会讨论这个门的问题，对不对？那些什么视觉错位啊，那些象征的建构很多也是由这个不在场的那些，比如说什么空洞啊、孔隙啊、缝隙啊、缺失、断裂，由这些不可见的东西连接起来，对吧？但是格式塔早期的思想，它就是我觉得它还是更多的关注在场而非不在场。但是到晚期这个在可见跟不可见开始，他们就开始更关注不在场的东西是什么，不在场的东西是什么，其实就是意识形态。
The flesh is something of an elemental principle and an anonymity of visibility. Most notably, he establishes the notion of a gap, a car, at the heart of every experience, which upsets the sort of integrated unity of experience that was evident in his earlier work. This implicit critique of his earlier thought becomes explicit in the working notes of this book, where he acknowledges the possibility that phenomenology of perception was hampered by a philosophy of consciousness. We don't know what would have come of this work had he finished it. Unfortunately, he died unexpectedly from a stroke while working on it. But I think we see some elements of...
我给你们讲，刚才不是给你们讲那个魏明子信仰学习脸中脸吗？我跟你说，我当时是说胡说八道，我现在仍然是在说胡说八道。胡说八道是指什么？是指他用这个来戒色，就是胡说八道。他似乎就是跟你们说。就是说什么那个不在场的恐怖，当你能发现这个真相的时候，你就可以用来戒色了，你就可以用来摆脱拿定你的坏女人了。这不是白日做梦吗？因为你那个现象就恰恰是说，你这个美就是有那个不在场的恐怖支撑起来的，所以越能发现这个恐怖，你就会觉得越美啊。就是你越压抑，它就是越勾你嘛。这不是它这个东西不就是风月宝鉴吗？就跟你说，你就看背面啊，千万不能看正面，就是给你看背面的。那谁拿着能看背面？肯定天天看正面啊！你越看背面越恐怖，正面就越好看，对不对？就跟你看 A 片一样，你天天全看 A 片，一天也看80个小时，你也不想看了。你那个10000部什么叫什么爱国什么强国学习里面加一部 A 片，你看你是不是就只看 A 片？所以我就跟你说，他那个目的论是有问题的，他那个存在论、生存论是有问题的。就是说什么啊，我给你们看这个东西就来戒色，戒个屁啊！
Of it in the 1960 essay. In that essay, he indicates that phenomenology need not be a philosophy of consciousness. Rather, phenomenology descends into its own substratum in a manner that finds convergences with psychoanalysis. As such, he writes, they're both aiming toward the same latency, by which he means that concealed, unmanifested substratum of being that is outside of consciousness. Nonetheless, he does reinforce one of the criticisms Lacan levels against him in stating that both phenomenology and psychoanalysis can lead us toward a humanism of truth without metaphysics. Lacan has been very clear to indicate that psychoanalysis is not, nor can it be, a humanism, regardless of whether one understands that term as an affirmation of the goodness of humanity, the possibility of freedom and agency, or the inherent dignity of all human beings. Question 3. What is the relationship between the death drive and the pleasure principle? One of the reasons why psychoanalysis cannot be a humanism is because of the death drive. In this lecture, Lacan greatly furthers his development of this concept. He's particularly keen on showing its connection to the pleasure principle, which on the surface would seem to oppose it. So let's first take up how Lacan presents the pleasure principle in this lecture. He reiterates what he said in the previous lecture regarding its homeostatic function in reducing excitatory tensions to a minimum. There's a few difficulties that emerge here. First, the idea that the pleasure principle aims at the cessation of pleasure doesn't align with our intuitive understanding of pleasure. Yet, that's exactly what it aims at, the end of pleasure. And it's for this reason that it was originally called the unpleasure principle. A second difficulty Lacan notes is that this restorative function of the pleasure principle is not readily distinguished from the repetitive tendency of the death drive. And so, how do we understand this? Lacan deploys the concept of entropy to illustrate his point. The second law of thermodynamics states that an isolated system left to its own devices inevitably arrives at thermodynamic equilibrium, or what is the highest possible entropy. Entropy is a state of disorder or lack of organization. So, for example, heat that is concentrated in one part of the room will, without any intervention, eventually disperse equally within that given space. Entropy marks the arrow of time in the universe itself as it marches toward inevitable disorder, which is theorized to end up in the heat death of the universe. However, if this is the case, how is it that any complexity has emerged at all, especially in the form of life and human intelligence? First, we need to keep in mind that order and complexity are not the same in physics. To keep this simple, let's take the example of a cup of coffee with foamed milk on top. At first, the system contains very low entropy. It's highly ordered. Coffee and foam milk are concentrated and clearly distinct from one another. There's no mixing whatsoever. But this system is not very complex because there hasn't been any mixing. Over time, the milk and coffee begin to mix, leading to the swapping of coffee and milk molecules. But through this mixing, complexity increases as there are varying regions of coffee and milk mixtures throughout the cup. Complexity is the measure of how difficult it is to describe a system. The mixing leads to greater complexity as there is a heterogeneous distribution of the two substances. However, as entropy progresses,
有人教没有人教？我是怎么看懂这东西？就看呀，你就学就好了呀。我直播，我们去年到现在直播了1年300多天，我可能就那么不到100天，可能几十天，就这种纯娱乐的或无所事事的。其他的不是每天时间就是在看吗？就多看，你还搁这教，你可别搁这教了。哎呦，你自己学啥你自己不知道，你还搁这教别人。一天2、3个小时至少，对不对？所以我的意思是，这东西不需要你什么学习方法，你就是天天看，你投入跟我一样多的时间，你也能明白，也没什么不明白的。还有你们就是有些就是也不想学啊，就看不懂那本坐着浪费时间，你看不懂的部分你就去查嘛，辛苦也好辛苦，这是上班，这就是工作呀。有啥好辛苦的？你看不懂东西，你要去，比如说骑个台看不懂，你要去看相关的东西。你自己看，你看不懂硬看，就天天搁那看，那怎么可能懂呢？所以我就是跟你们说，你们大部分人看这东西，你们就不想学会。你们要是想学会，早就学会了。
The milk and coffee become thoroughly mixed and homogeneous in such a way that the system returns to a low level of complexity. Each part of the beverage contains a similar content as any other. But there's also a low level of order. There's no longer any distinction between coffee and foam milk. In this example, entropy is necessary for complexity. And this is how something as complex as life and human intelligence may emerge as a result of entropy, even if ultimately it will be responsible for dissolving that complexity as well. How does this relate to the death drive and pleasure principle? The death drive does produce a tendency toward a kind of annihilation. However, it does so by the most circuitous paths, along the paths of life. In other words, the pleasure principle of the life drive emerges from the death drive's march toward an absolute minimum of tension. As such, they're always mixed together in different degrees. Freud says as much, indicating that the death drive would elude us if not for its principal expression through eros. This reveals an interesting parallel. Eros, or the life drive, derives from the death drive, but the death drive is observed only in and through the life drive, where it comes to be expressed by the compulsion to repeat. In the next video, we'll return to Lecture 7, take up this notion of repetition and how exactly it sustains the living being, what it teaches us about how abject failure rather than adaptation is the means for a specifically human kind of learning, and what Kierkegaard offers us to our understanding of the concept of repetition. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.
我想起来了，下一期我们看过对吧？我们上次讲那个齐泽克哪本书的时候，论重复。行吧，今儿就学到这里吧，明儿接着学。看不懂就看点能看懂的呀。看吧，又有人来教了。遇到不懂的词最好方法就是去查，又有人来教了。你拉康那个研讨班，你去查好了，所有的词儿都看得，你都能查到，你也看不懂。但是你们为什么非要学这个呀？我是觉得纳闷儿，学点别的不行吗？你问你们学不学？学。也不知道再学一下，因为你们事实上也可以不学这东西，你学这么难的东西干嘛？学点简单的不好。它事实上也不是很难，比如说什么现象学什么之类的，它那个意思是什么？我一解释你们都听得懂，简单解释都听得懂。但是我为什么不愿意解释呢？就不愿意比如说花时间好好背课给你们讲明白这些东西呢？是我觉得讲明白这些东西又能怎么样呢？讲明白了你们就各方面会有什么也没有什么进步啊，因为你们是比如说。我讲了一点点的某几个就是部分，你之前听不懂，然后你现在听懂了，然后你觉得就是说你掌握了某种高低知识学，但这个没有用，你们能明白吗？就好像我们说，比如说我劝大家健身，就是为什么要劝你们健身？减轻，因为其实减轻不了病情啊，没有用的。就好像说我劝你们健身，就是说健身并不是一个结果，直接获得了一个健康的身体或者是一个什么好身材，那都是次要的。健身其实就是你自己那个调整自己生活的过程。 就是说我要如何实现这件事情，如何有规律，就是有计划的、有步骤的，一步一步实现，如何处理好这些生活中的问题，就这个过程是主要的。就好像我说学习这个什么精神分析之类的，就在这里，其实比如说每天在直播间看这个，其实就是个学习的习惯，对不对？每天就花一点时间去看点严肃的东西，不是就天天搁这打游戏啊，什么搁那批判呢，搁那什么见证什么之类的。就这些知识点，我跟你们讲明白有什么用？我是可以备课，就比如说我愿意那个花1周时间，然后备一期非常精彩的，就全给你们讲。完了讲了之后，你们就掌握一门高级知识学啊。然后呢，然后你们所有问题你们还是仍然没有解决啊，就是一样，就是你学习这个东西的过程，你自己想整明白那些东西的过程，那个才是对你真正有帮助的，而不是说我讲给你听，那有什么用呢？我不愿意讲，并不是说，比如说这东西花时间或者什么的。我要是说实话，我就还是这句话，我要是真的能帮到你们，比如说让你们过得别天天犯病啊，别这么憋屈啊，因为我也是像你从你们这种就是症状犯病的生活中过来的，我也知道那种什么就是犯病时候那种难受，对不对？那种痛苦，那种症状。问题是你在这症状中，你还在享乐，难以摆脱这种状态。我知道这个状态，就是说，如果我跟你们讲，比如说我备课，比方说我就每天备10个小时，备1个月，我给你们讲一节课，然后你们就能就摆脱就是你们现在那些症状、那些问题什么的，我也愿意讲。问题是摆脱不了，就是我只能就陪伴你们，就说这个过程你们得经历。然后就是说有些东西你不懂，我可能讲1-2句，你顺着这个思路自己去学习去思考，然后你慢慢的就是说通过这个日常的专题性的反思，这个学习的思考的以及实践的过程，然后可以就一步一步去达到你想要的生活。它只能是这样的一个，就是没有什么捷径可以走的，必须要通过你的汗水、泪水，你的青春，它就是这样一步一步的过程。没有什么捷径。这个逼又来了，叫什么文艺华写作组。想要学并不是因为想要减轻，而是单纯的求知思考。你最好是能单纯的求知思考。问题就是你都不知道你这个求知思考是不是单纯的，你怎么知道你是不是单纯的？还有什么叫单纯的呀？你说这个话的时候，你先自己思考你说的话吧。啥叫单纯的？我都不懂这句话，啥叫单纯的求知思考？我一听这种话就满头问号，就没法跟你不知道啥叫单纯的。所以说，就是在直播间听这个东西，在直播间就那种假装很愿意好好学习的，就是什么，我就可能满口说黑话，假装什么问问题，假装什么在思考这问题拽词儿的。我觉得你们这些逼就是日常就最没得学的那些人。就是你就会说，比如说什么，就是因为你日常但凡学了，听我讲你就很轻松，你就说啊，反正听不懂的就听听没关系，就是有可能听到有能学到东西没关系，以后自己看就更省力一点，反正就是以一种轻松的态度来。越在这个直播间越就是认真学的，肯定就是平时没学，来直播间赎罪了，就是日常平时都享乐去了，然后一天看2个小时，觉得自己赎完罪了，然后日常该干嘛去了。对，或者是觉得啊，我听到了这些什么精神分析，这种什么高级知识学啊，什么这些东西，就这东西吧，听一听。因为我有时候会解释的东西，就是它特别难、特别枯燥的部分，我不会解释的。我一般会解释的东西都是一些，就是说我同样也是我自己曾经有过的问题，我觉得大家一般会遇到的问题，就是说一些常识性的，或者是对于其他的哲学理解会有帮助的，就比较。叫什么？就是基础的一些基础的，就是原则上的问题。然后它更就是精致的那些部分我都不怎么想解释，我觉得还听懂就听，听不懂就算了，其实无所谓的，不重要。就好像这个我们听这个东西，就好像老师给你讲那个什么公理之类的一样，你只要知道那个公理是怎么着就行，你不用管它怎么证出来的，你知道那哥德尔不完备定理结论就行了呗。你还得看，难道你还得看明白它那个不完备定理那什么几百页论文怎么写出来的吗？你有那个本事吗？就是这个哲学上的东西也是一样，你就知道这个哲学家这个思想是什么，然后大概在这个思想史里的位置是什么，它的结论是什么，原则方向是什么，就可以了。就公理你会用就行了，你用哥德尔不完备定理也没人要你那个什么推导过程。所以拉康这研讨班也是，你也不用管他那个就特别精致那些过程它是怎么，你有这个就是能力看明白，那当然是可以看明白。问题是你那么费劲，你就别看明白了，就记这个结论就行了。